We're really thankful to have two respondents here today, Dr. Shayla Shukla and Dr. Brian Rice. And they're going to briefly respond to Dr. Thompson's presentation. So we're going to start with Dr. Shukla, but before I ask him and then Dr. Rice to speak, I'm just going to give a few introductory points about them. Dr. Shukla is a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg and has done research in the areas of Indigenous knowledge for participatory governance and community-based development and resource management. He takes a participatory approach to his research and has researched a number of topics related to Indigenous knowledge systems, traditional medicine, etc. He is currently involved in two research projects. One, he is the thematic leader for a research project looking at the role of coarse millets in food security in South Asia. And secondly, he's involved in an action research project that's exploring the value of traditional food in Canada. So he's going to speak first, and then Dr. Brian Rice, and I'll introduce Brian right now. Dr. Brian Rice is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg, and he teaches a number of courses there, as well as teaching a course for Men of Science College in the area of conflict and development issues. Dr. Rice teaches a number of courses that draw on the research that he's done and the writing that he's done in the area of Indigenous traditions. And he's the author of several books, including his most recent book, The Haudenosaunee, which is looking at traditions within the Iroquois history. And interestingly, Brian, a key thing that he seeks to do is to write books that then tie in with his teaching and enrich his teaching. In addition to his research, Dr. Rice has traveled extensively and visited Indigenous people in a number of settings. So I'm going to ask Dr. Shukla and then Dr. Rice to respond to Dr. Thompson's presentation. So I've asked them to keep their comments to 3 to 5 minutes each. So they'll talk, and then after that we'll go back to our speaker and hear her responses, and then we'll go to the question and answer session.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Shirley. I think I was a student of yours class. I think it was your first year as a prof, and it was my first year as a student at Natural Resource Institute sometime in 2002. And I think you started off your journey with growing hope. And I think now you have moved to the harvesting hope, and now I think you're talking about flooding hope. So I see that journey, and I've been very fortunate to see that journey over the last 10 years. And I must say that, there's a lot of ground that you have covered today. And the indigenous food sovereignty mafia is growing, actually, in academics. So you are not just a lone crusader now. You have a whole gang who is going to be working along with you. So thank you so much for, I really congratulate you on taking on this very important cause, especially in rural Manitoba. Since my time is very restricted, I would speak from my experiences in one of the projects that we have just recently started in Fishery River Cree Nations in Manitoba, and then some of the experiences that I've had with Dr. Patel from Men of Science College and his colleagues, and we have been working on these IDRC supported food projects on value of millets and how could we revalorize use of millets and associated knowledge systems to promote the food security. I would start off by picking up what you have left actually to us. You talked about the cultural aspects and the spiritual aspects of food. I've been working on traditional medicine and medicinal plant for so many years. And when I started working on the food, we interviewed 17 elders in Fishery River. And one of the biggest lessons that I learned, and that in fact changed my perspective, is that food is a medicine. So there is no compartment like this. So food is for healthy people and medicine for sick people. I think that sort of perception has got changed, and I really would like to sort of seek some comments from you on that front. Like, did you see that food and medicine basket, coming very close together? You did talk about in one of the slides about how people have used traditional plants and medicine as a food. And I think that is something to be remembered. The other aspect that I'd like to talk about is the discourse around food. I think we have, we have been constantly using the term food security. And then lastly, you talked about food sovereignty. And you talked about BC and Don Morrison's work on indigenous food sovereignty, which has become very recently sort of come into vogue. Now there is this shift from food security, which has become a donor-driven jargon, and then food sovereignty, which is more like a social justice kind of approach, a right to food approach. And then you talk, and recently the scholars have started talking about indigenous food sovereignty. So I think the future to me is indigenous food sovereignty. I think you talked about food sovereignty and an appeal to government of Canada to sort of how do we implement food sovereignty? Now food security probably is easy to implement because it's easy to measure. It's a more like a quantitative approach the way you did in a lot of places. But I think you did touch upon some of the aspects. So when I spoke to elders, they said the concept of food sovereignty, the food itself, and I said, what is food security to you? I think we have to go by that definition. Their definition is quite different than way we perceive in academics. The food and food security and food sovereignty. I'd like to bring certain aspects, like they talked about safety, harvesting, collective gatherings, sharing, waiting. So you go to hunt moose, and then you wait. That teaches you the lesson how to wait for an animal, a sacred dimension, offering, building values, identities. And I think finally, what is the most sort of powerful metaphor that I found in terms of defining this indigenous food sovereignty is the food is way of life. It's not just something related to health or something else. So I would like to get some sort of pulse of wisdom on that aspect of this indigenous food sovereignty. How do you see that becomes more like moving from a discourse to a practice? And how can we make that happen? So that's a sort of a major comment I have. I have several other, I was like very fascinated by this control over natural resources. Like we talked about food and cultural food, but who controls the territory? And I think that's a very important issue. I think so. Food is an identity. Food is a reclamation of traditional rights. That is also one of the sort of missing dimension that I've been seeing, like in the discourse of food and around food. Nobody talks really about reclamation of traditional rights, especially with the recent legislative change that happened in Manitoba about giving traditional rights and recognition to the Métis people. So I would like to get some feedback on that as well. So I'll pass on the mic to Brian. Thank you.
Sego. I'm kind of a late call-in here, so it's a bit of an ad lib thing. I guess I haven't lived in the north or the mid-north or so for about 30 years. I used to teach in a school, Anishinaabe school, and I was a principal for a year and kind of got, climatized, I guess, to the community and such. And, that was basically my first teaching jobs. But in that time, it was kind of the, about 30 years ago, there was still quite a few elders that were, teaching the kids, to go out into the bush and stuff. And, I think one thing about the film that I did notice is there seems to be some hope, at least for the traditional foods, the country foods again. It's funny, where I lived, they had a word or two words basically for a freezer. They called it the stingy box. And the reason they called it the stingy box was because for the first time people hoarded food rather than shared it, because traditionally that's basically what they would do, is they would always share, right? In those times too, and it's not that long ago, but regardless, I think there has been some changes over the years. Everybody had they didn't have their traditional territories, they had their hunting camps, and that was always standard. So people could go out for an extended period of time And, with all the social problems that would happen inside the village, especially when the, checks would come in at the end of the month, after that, everybody would disperse and go out into the bush. And, basically they would never take any of the vices with them. It was always a very, very healthy lifestyle for them. And so, people were relatively healthy with the country foods. They weren't isolated so much that they didn't have access to other foods, but it was still pretty isolated. But one of the things that I did notice, one of the changes that you could see happening is when people went out hunting in the community that I was in, they would always hunt moose and such, and they had all the traditional ways of cutting up the moose and such and getting the meat and everything else. But if you went into the more rural areas, mostly the people where I was, they would eat the meat, mostly the meat. But if you went into more rural communities, they would eat the marrow of the bone. And different parts of the moose that the community where I was in, they didn't utilize any longer, One of the big changes, too, was, the sudden availability of junk food, and it started to change. Traditionally for the Anishinaabe where I was, to be big wasn't a bad thing, either for women. In fact, it was considered to be an attraction. But you can be healthy and big, The problem with the junk food and all that is you get big, but you're unhealthy. And when you're unhealthy, you can't practice those traditional practices. I mean, you can go out in a boat, but you can't stay extended periods of time because you're not healthy enough. And, one of the things through my travels that I noticed was when I went to traditional societies in other parts of the world, I saw a lot of the same dynamic happening. When I was out in Thailand, for instance, the issue was swidden farming. People having their territories narrowed down so that the slash and burn agriculture was no longer viable. And they couldn't survive that way, and thus they started to get hungry. Same with the trapping territories in the north. One time everybody had their particular territory. It wasn't a trap line, it was actually a territory. They would move on that every couple of years to ensure that there was a survival of the animals. But that takes a lot of land. Sometimes it takes 50, 100 square miles of land for one extended family, eh? One of the things that I also learned just recently, I was just from an elder as to why people went from the it wasn't just the priests and the ministers that put people into nuclear families. One of the reasons why people started to go into nuclear families and stop sharing so much was because, according to this elder, is when we all lived together, when the disease came, we all died together. So when smallpox came and it would hit a lodge where you would have several extended families, everybody would die. So people started to move into smaller houses, individual houses, so that if you got sick, you weren't infecting everybody else. So that had a big transference in the values of communal values of keeping people together and such. What I'm seeing today is kind of interesting because there's kind of been a transference of urban so-called culture and spirituality starting to filter up into the country, If you were to talk, for instance, about the seven teachings 30 years ago, 40 years ago, nobody would have known what you're talking about. They would have understood it, but they didn't have to put it into words. You didn't have to articulate something like honesty or truth or wisdom. It was entrenched and ingrained inside the culture itself. It was part of that traditional culture, right? I was thinking about what Shailesh was saying too, about going out, because I've been out hunting, with the people, usually maybe about 3, 4 in the morning or so, go out hunting moose and such, and it is that. I often tell especially the future teachers, I say, understand this about traditional people. They don't ask questions. They don't put up their hand, and there's a reason for that. Maybe it's not viable today in the city so much, but sometimes those values carry on. They don't do that because when you live a traditional life, you have to listen. You don't question your elders when they're telling you how to survive, I often think too, about when we think about today what Aboriginal spirituality is. Well, for people in the north, the spirituality was the hunt. You can't separate the hunt from the spirituality. And that's why it's such a big struggle to keep those traditions and cultures alive today, because, of course, we don't very much hunt any longer. So, and for a man in those days to be part of agriculture, that was the unmanly thing to do. That's the woman's realm. That's her place, in a sense. And the man's place is the hunt. The woman is the land, taking care of the agriculture. When I worked in a First Nations school, our principal was Mohawk. I'm Mohawk. She started an agricultural little co-op there. It didn't work that well with the Anishinaabe because most of the men didn't want to grow stuff. It was considered to be unmanly to do so. It wasn't part of their value system. I see that possibly changing now. But of course, that's part of the changing values that are happening within the communities as well. Anyway, I see my little cue here, so that's where I'll leave it. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Shailesh and Brian. And we just have a couple of minutes for Shirley's response, because we'd like to leave a half hour, like a clear half hour, for folks who have questions and comments for Shirley and the panel. So Shirley, I don't know if you want to pick up on one or 2 points. I mean, there are a lot of good ideas that were raised, but if you wanted to pick up on 1 or 2 points.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I think food security is a subset of food sovereignty, but we can't lose that. People have a right to eat and right to food. And it's important yes, it is important to measure it, because otherwise you don't know. And nobody is dealing with this problem because nobody is responsible if they don't measure it. And they should be held responsible. And I love this concept of a stingy box in the freezer. And I really hope that this country food program is adopted in more places, and I can see it going to Garden Hill very soon as well, where all of a sudden the transformation is going to be this freezer is going to be the sharing box. And we're going to bring it back to that, because it's not going to be the household level where everybody has to plug in. It's at the community level, and everyone's taking care of each other, as was the way in the past. That's the model for food security and food sovereignty, and now it's just trying to make that happen, considering real problems in poverty. There are poverty issues, and I think we have to really seriously, as a Canadian society, approach these and start to think about them and resolve them. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Shirley and Brian and Shailesh. And I'd like to now turn to you all and ask you if you have questions or comments. There's 2 microphones down here. Alternatively, if you'd prefer, we could bring the microphones up to you. But please, if you have a question or a comment, now's your opportunity. And maybe just as some of you are kind of forming a question or a comment, if I could just mention that we have another presentation coming up in November, and we have courses that we're offering through this series in the winter term. And yeah, so please, questions. Yes, Gabrielle, please. Can you come down to the microphone?
Maybe it's because we have to go there that nobody wants to.
Maybe that's the problem, yeah.
Okay. I am Muisca. This is an indigenous community in Colombia, in the central part of the country. And I have been here in Canada for 3 years now. I will ask very direct questions. One is, given that most of the Aboriginal population in Canada is now in cities, how can we address this issue for the new circumstances? It's a very critical issue because if people don't have the possibility to decide what they eat, it's very difficult that they have right or possibilities to decide on something else. So it's a critical issue for population that is in the city now. And the second question is, the presentation is very powerful in bringing the issues and showing the different connections. And I know it was not your intention to deal with international issues, but when this global economy is bringing nations in new trade agreements, some economies like this in Canada or in other northern countries are actually having very heavy impacts in the agricultural system and in indigenous lands all over the world because of the search for natural resources or because the exportation of commodities at a lower price that they still call, for example, food security, but it's not food sovereignty for indigenous people in other parts of the country. So I see that it's a responsibility also with indigenous people in other parts of the world, not only here in Canada. So only those small concerns that I have tonight. Thanks.
I don't know how to respond to the first issue about the growing urban Aboriginal populations. But I think one of the issues that, like one of the findings that sort of I discovered over the period of years of my working in this project, IDRC project, the younger people, they do like traditional food, but they don't like to get engaged into making of traditional food, the preparation. They find it more cumbersome. And this is in relation to the small millet project that we have been working with in 8 different sites in South Asia. And I don't have an answer to that, but I can just give you some insight from the empirical work that we have done. So I think there is a preference, changing preferences among younger generations. Now again, within Aboriginal populations, Gabriel, you talked about in cities, I think they are mostly younger people. And how do we sort of, again, looking at how do we measure and change and understand their preferences? And one of the strongest sort of dimension of food sovereignty or indigenous food sovereignty is culturally adapted food. And how do we bring back that food? And I think some of the ideas that you mentioned and the niche food initiatives, I think they might be the other ways. The other ways could be, well, we could blame market to really not providing access to food, or we could blame market for generating neoliberal agenda and sort of robbing the idols of food sovereignty. But at the same time, we could also use market to provide some culturally adapted food. And how do we sort of produce and generate those markets? I have yet to see. There is no easy answer. I've not seen many examples in Canada, as far as my knowledge, where Aboriginal younger populations have opportunities to access to culturally adapted food.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things, when I was teaching that we failed to do as an educational system or whatever is we didn't really incorporate the land into our curriculum very much. I think the Cree of James Bay have done a better job of that, but where I was, we really didn't incorporate that because everybody was so concerned about academics and such, eh? So a lot of our kids kind of got lost in our own system. I mean, it was a band-controlled school. It wasn't a government-controlled school. In those days, you ran your own curriculum. It was, considered your standards were considered viable to get into college in those days. If you're a band-controlled school, so it was a little different. The other thing, though, that I was thinking about was what we kind of fail in the city to do is create incentive for those who live in the country, or by bringing kids from the city into those communities sometimes, so that the people the kids in the country can feel valued, because they do still have some skills there that the kids in the city don't. It's one thing to learn about the 7 teachings and all that, but it's another thing to actually apply them in in a particular way that actually has some relevance, besides just a philosophy,
Great questions, thank you. Yes, lots of people are in the city, and I think Nietzsche does provide a venue. It's working with us. We're not marketers. I'm not an agricultural person. I'm learning how to package. We're learning how to package. We're learning this. So if they can work with us, with the Garden Hill community, and we've had several shipments, and it's getting it's beautiful now. But at first, we were really difficult. And just a place to start to market goods. Let's face it, those planes go up there full of food, and they come back to some degree empty. There are definitely the people in the communities need the fish first and the food first. But there are berries, there are things, they also need market. They need money. And so there has to be ways to incorporate it in our economic system so that they can get money in a way that's sustainable and producing sustainable capacity. And what I see with Nietzsche, but also Michael Champagne, and this working with a good food box in the North End, where if the possibility of actually including culturally appropriate food, it can be fusion food, like Cooking with the Wolf, that's the best show ever, he's so funny. So this way of incorporating some aspects into our cultural aspects, I would love to see, someone was saying that Superstore has so improved, it's got a Middle East aisle, but it still doesn't have a First Nations aisle. It needs that. We are in Canada, home of, on treaty territory. So that's something that could be envisioned. And the global economy, definitely these new agreements, the GMOs, there are so many issues that are not unpacked. And it was maybe going back to Shalish's comment a bit about food sovereignty, is that there was a recent conference in Yale around food sovereignty. And, Indigenous food sovereignty isn't really the focus, right? There was one person speaking on that. So the issues were really about this global, the trade agreements, and that's an important aspect as well. And yes, it was exciting to hear what is happening and some of the theorizing that's going on around that.
Okay, I think there's one question. And please, we've got time, so think of questions and comments.
Okay, hi. I guess my question is most specifically for you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm most curious about the community garden aspect that you've been working with in Harvest for Hope. I'm curious about if there were any barriers that you have encountered and how those have, shaped the way that these projects have formed, and where you see them going in the future. Like what possibilities do you see for us attaining this 30 or 40%?
Yeah. Well, the problem is they're done on such a small scale. There's no tractors in the north. Can you believe it? Like, how can you really farm without a tractor, right? And I was at an agroecology conference. There is one. How old is it? It might be a 1960s tractor in Woboden. So I can't, okay, there is one. And I'm talking north of the Interlake, or really north of Thompson, I should say, is give some implements. What I've seen happen is these programs have just been provided a few shovels. They're sharing shovels, they're sharing a crappy little rototiller with clay soil, and what's happening is 30, 40, 50 gardens. Like, people are taking this up. If it was actually a program that was rolled out properly with proper implements, with training, a real, with employment opportunities for youth as well, right? There are very few opportunities. That's why this Frontier Leaf Rapids program is so great. And the gardens are fabulous. I've never, it puts my garden to shame. So there's huge opportunities for this, but it has to be done on a bigger scale and considering creativity and options and possibilities. This agroecology, I was always asking about the north, and they're saying, you should get them into pine nuts. Pine nuts will pay. So thinking out of the box, right? Which is, different kinds of pines from here, but definitely something that will grow. So looking at other opportunities, and I'd like to see some real dollars, some real training dollars, and it will fly. Okay.
Okay, other questions, please?
Hi, Shirley.
Hi.
My name is Brian, and I really appreciated your presentation tonight. And I was born and raised up in northern Saskatchewan. My father was a fur trader, and we lived among the native people. And I'm Quarter Cree myself. And at present, I live on I have a little farm. It's a 70-acre farm, and no power, no electricity, no running water in our home. But I have a system set up for doing all of that, and we live off the land, so to speak. And I, at present, am working on Hollow Water First Nation. I did 300 gardens up there last year, raised bed gardens. And I have an earthworm farming operation where I have what's called earthworm castings. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or not, but it's an organic fertilizer, and I bring in a mineral blend, and we increase food production by up to 40% increase in food production with whatever we grow. And I would be more than happy to, I'm a marketer as well, and I market my products all over the country. I have several thousand customers that buy my products from me. And I'd be glad to volunteer and help in any way I can to assist in this whole project, because I've got a track to run on as well. And I think you've started a very good little project in a small way. And if you want to expand that and maximize your potential on that, there's lots of ways to do that. But it's just, you've cracked the door open up there, I think, and that's a very good start. And there's a lot of assistance that could come. There's a lot of monies available, I believe, in a lot of these places, but they won't pry the door open and let the money loose. But there is money available, and I think if there was a unity brought together with powerhouse people such as yourself and others who can come with some credibility and clout and backup through universities and all of these things, because a little guy like me, they won't listen to me, even though I got the proof and the goods. It's just like, get that guy out of here. You know, he might upset the apple cart for us and open up something, and it might work. So anyway, I'm 100% behind you. I thank you for your presentation. It was great, and I think you're well on your way, and I will do anything I can to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That's amazing, actually, because we are struggling. We are not marketers. We came up with a business plan, and because nobody else would do it, right? And they needed one. And yeah, so we would really benefit from that marketing advice, and from seeing logistical aspects are not easy in the north, right? Flying food in and out is not an easy is not an easy project. And it's not just the difficulty of these plains is they're pristine lakes, inland lakes, so they take full planes to get the fish and fly the fish back to the main island lake where it's processed and filleted and then sent out again. So it's a very complicated prospect that is providing great fish. So if we can connect with those people who appreciate that, right? Whereas every other fish, most fish you're getting is from Winnipeg, which is a highly polluted lake. Wouldn't you rather have a nice, pristine lake to buy your fish from, healthy fish?
There is a place on Main Street that's set up now, and they take on all the wild rice and berries and all that kind of stuff.
Nietzsche Commons?
I'm sorry?
Is that Nietzsche Commons that you're referring to?
I think it is.
Yeah. Shirley had mentioned that.
Yeah.
So
Thank
we're
you.
working with them, but we need to work with you too, I think,
Yeah,
Brian.
There's, they say, don't panic, eat panic.
Yeah.
I say, don't panic, grow and eat organic.
That's great.
Okay, I think we have another question. Julie.
Hi,
Hi, Judy.
my name's Julie. Thank you, Shirley, for your presentation. I'm just so happy that you've decided to turn your attentions and interest to northern Manitoba, because mine are up there as well, and I think there's a lot of people who feel they don't have a voice, so somebody doing what you're doing gives a lot of people a voice. So I appreciate what you're doing, and the presentation was super powerful. before I ask my question, the only improvement that I could think to make to a session like this is something that a couple of elders have taught me, as I'm occasionally asked to speak about Indigenous issues, is that do your best to build into your budgets travel dollars for a Northern elder to attend any events like this. And so it's super hard because budgets are always really tight, but I'm trying to do that now with my new budget. So I've been working for funding agencies for about 10 years now. And I like to ask this question because I feel like my role within the agencies I've been working for is to try and cultivate better support from funding agencies to the communities that they seek to support. So my question's for all three of you, but what do you feel makes a good partner? What are the activities and characteristics of a funding agency or a charity or a government granting body that make them actually a good partner, a culturally appropriate partner, and a partner that is actually working towards significant impact in the communities that they seek to serve? Thank you.
I would again, speak from the perspective of the elders that I've been working with in Fishery River. I think one of the, and you're right, I think it's very easy to find, support like bringing those elders to the universities and even small costs that we never thought about that, doing a smudge ceremony and then there is no budget line, and those are very, very practical issues. I think there needs to be a reorientation, I would say reformulation of some budgetary priorities within university or academic institutions. Having said that, I think there are openness and within those communities in terms of what is coming from the top, but I think we should also start listening to them and then build our project around them. For example, we talked about community gardening. When we started talking about promoting community gardening in Fishery River, Carol Kuchran, who was there, she told me that community gardening is not a new thing. It was always there before 100 years, 200 years. So we are not teaching them new thing. So I don't think our priorities then should change and promote something, those fanciful ideas. I think two biggest suggestions that I may have is ask communities of what they want, and in terms of revalorizing, formulating, revising, redefining, reorienting some of the things that they have been doing already. It's already there. Community gardening has already been there. You are talking about thinking outside the box. The Fishery River folks are doing box gardening, which is they call community gardening. Their way of doing gardening is, community gardening in the box. Garden doesn't have to be outside. So I think it's there in the communities. We need a mediator who can then go to those communities and then work. I think funding agencies have limitations to really go to those communities and listen to their voices. I think we need people like Shirley and people who have been doing a lot of work with Indigenous communities to really listen to their stories and then decide on the priorities.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it's just a pretty simple thing. It's what we always talk about with Indigenous research is, it's what Shailesh was saying, it's just about listening, and getting the perspective and understanding what the needs of the people are from the people themselves. We don't see too much of that happening with, at least we know with governments, obviously. So, I think that's basically the key is understanding the dynamics as well of the community. A lot of the communities in the north, at least where I worked or I've been around, a lot of people were Christian. So they didn't really follow the traditional practices that you see more in the city. But regardless of that, the one thing that they like my friend Gillis, what he would always say is, I don't know these things like smudging and all that, but I'm a spiritual person because my spirituality is out on the land. And that's basically what the difference is some of the people in the north, their spirituality or understanding of spirituality, even with the loss of stories and everything else, there's still that understanding of that relationship that they have in the places that they are. And here we try and accommodate for young Aboriginals, I guess, to the circumstances that they live in here. So they learn about, the values, but from a more I guess, like written down place, I guess, I don't know how you say it. But, it's not so much the way they learn in the north, let's say, or how they had been learning in the north. I don't know what the situation with the kids are right now in the north, because I know some of the vices from the city are also filtering up there, and that's part of the issues. I know with my kids anyway, even back then, and it's not, like I said, it's not that long ago, but there are changes that took place. They would always judge themselves by what they saw on TV. And that was the hardest thing for them, because they would see poverty. They would see, didn't matter how well they ate, they would see themselves as being poor.
Shirley, did you want to reply to?
Sure.
And then we have time for one more question.
I agree, is listening to the community. Like, people will come to me and say, I want you to write this proposal. I tried and it didn't work. Can you write this proposal for me? And so I'm always directed what to do. And this is what they want. Okay, what do you want me to write? I'll write it, right? And in the format that they want, with the nice tables and budgets. But building in an elder, I would actually say build in a community coordinator. I've been able to do that with my mapping, is I had 2 workers in every community. Now, most university funds don't provide hardly any money for community people, which is problematic. So these people work full-time in the community on mapping. And that's the kind of budgets, they're bigger budgets, but the kind of budgets we need is to actually build capacity. I work in a graduate department, and unfortunately, I haven't, found a way to really access people at the master's and doctoral level. I'm just, I have a little bit. Moreau is a doctor, Dr. Moreau Ballard, but is realizing that that the community people know how to make things happen on the ground, and then finding a way of capacity building and working on the projects that they're ready and wanting to do. And, I've learned a lot, and I'm still learning, and it's not always easy.
Okay, our last question, Brendan Reimer. You started us off, and you're going to end us off.
So in trying to reshape economies in northern communities, and especially in the Northern Territories, and building capacity and confidence and leadership, they've looked at the co-op model. And Arctic Cooperatives has this whole system across Nunavut and the Northern Territories, in communities where the store isn't necessarily the northern store, it's the co-op store that is owned by the members of the community. And they make decisions together, and it's one member, one vote, and they elect the board. So it not only becomes a restructuring of, in some ways, their food system, it's a political tool, and it's an educational tool that puts not only the economy back in their hands, it puts decision-making back in their hands. And one of the legacies I understand is also the leadership piece, that in making decisions together in that way, and in learning about what it takes to reclaim their politics and their economy, they've developed the leadership skills that have then translated into so many other realms. So I'm curious, I've always been interested in kind of the question about why Arctic Cooperatives is just really up in the Northern Territories and not involved in Northern Manitoba communities, when these are some of the same issues that are being challenged. And now you're talking about building capacity and building skills and restructuring the economy, and they're being done through kind of a program way, or maybe through the band office, and so they accomplish a lot of the same pieces. But I'd be curious about whether or not the co-op model has been explored as kind of the economic model to reclaim it.
So fisheries are always cooperatives, right? They're not always following the 7 principles. There's not always transparency. There's not always perfect democracy, etc. But in these communities, fisheries, and the co-op we're working with, that is a co-op, Obakatawak. But as for the Arctic Co-op, I admire them so much, and they're placed here in Winnipeg, right? Their head office is here out of Winnipeg, and that's why when you compared prices in Nunavut and in Island Lake, which is much closer, there were lower prices. It's because the Arctic Co-op doesn't have as much of it's not as much of a profit machine. It returns its profit to the community, right? So it can fly 4 times farther and have many more costs associated with it, and yet provide food basically cheaper. So I've actually, every year, I take my class to visit the Arctic Co-op, and I invite people from Island Lakes, anyone to come along, and I've made a couple of, at least, relationships where Garden Hill is looking at Arctic Co-op. They did start a Arctic Co-op in Puckatawagan, which failed. So Arctic Co-op is a little shy to go ahead in Winnipeg, but I think having its headquarters here, it has a responsibility. And if the other co-ops, like the credit unions and the other, took on this challenge as well, there's a growing population in the north. It's not shrinking. They're not all coming to the urban centers. In fact, I think Garden Hill, what was it, grew by a colossal amount that I had to phone Stats Canada to check. It was so big in the last 5 years. Like, was it 40%? It was huge, to see if the numbers were right. So yes, these communities are growing. They have potentials, and I think it's prime opportunity for credit unions, co-ops, and these communities are waiting. South Indian Lake is another one that would welcome, very much welcome, a cooperative. But there is some training requirement, and that's what Arctic Co-op feels, is that these communities didn't come out of the same tradition. They came out of a tradition of the Hudson Bay Company or the Northwest Company, right? Where they were always trading, and it wasn't always with these companies, and that cooperatives hasn't been always in their history or taught in their schools. But everyone in the north would welcome that. Is the profit margin, everyone knows on these northern stores, is huge. And the produce is horrible. So this would deal with so many of the issues in the north.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Brian, did you want to say something?
Just going to finish off?
Sure.
Yeah, I won't deal, because I think that was a pretty great answer that you gave. I just wanted to say something. In the Anishinaabe language, separates things that are alive from things that aren't alive. And in the communities that I worked in, moose, wias, was considered to be living. Wias was something that is dead. So moose meat was considered alive. Meat itself was considered dead in the language. So I'm just thinking about food being a living thing, in that concept. The other thing, I'm just going to finish this off because it's about my book, The Haudenosaunee, okay? Also Haudenosaunee in the Onondaga language. And what I was going to say is I actually taught a course on the Haudenosaunee about 20 years ago at university. And I had one student, and he never came to class. And so he brought out his paper, and he started to read his paper on the Haudenosaunee. And that's, student. Never attended.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, Dr. Shirley Thompson, Dr. Brian Rice, and Dr. Shailesh Shukla. But it's not over, actually, because no, it's fine for you folks to move. I mean, for us, for those of us who are interested in this topic, because Menno Simons College in the IDS program has committed to 6 public lectures, and this one that Dr. Thompson and Dr. Rice and Dr. Shukla have done is our second. We have 4 more because we want to take seriously this issue of food security and farm sustainability. The next one is in November 21st, 7 o'clock here. Dr. Haroon Akram Lodi, he's the head of the International Development Studies program at Trent University, and just came out with a book. I forget the name of the book. Anyways, he is going to be speaking on feeding the world, is hunger inevitable? So his focus is going to be looking internationally at the food security situation. And if you're interested in international food security, please come. It would be really, really interesting. And also to remind you that we have 3 courses that are being offered on this subject in a winter term. 2 at Menno Simons College, a 2,000 level and 4,000 level course called How We Grow, Share, and Eat, and a 3,000 level course at Canadian Mennonite University. So if you have an interest in those courses in the event in November or the events in the winter term. We've got 3 more presentations. Please come and join us and ask any one of the college staff or IDS faculty. We're going to be up having some dessert, so you're welcome to join us right now for dessert and coffee and stuff. And so once again, thank you very much for coming and for participating. Thanks.